have 4 different ways that we can prove that two lines are parallel to each other, and to do that we're going to use our transversals again. And we're also going to use the same angles we've talked about before: corresponding angles, alternate exterior, alternate interior, and consecutive interior angles. And to do that we're just going to take the converse, the if-then statements we learned before, and flip them around to prove this. So for example, specifically we're going to try to prove or show that corresponding angles are congruent. We could also show that either alternate exterior or alternate interior angles are congruent, and finally we could also show that consecutive interior or same-side interior angles are supplementary, meaning they add up to 180. So those are the 4 different ways we're going to use to prove that two lines are parallel to each other. So let's try to prove that these two lines M and N are parallel to each other. I can see the transversal comes through, and the first thing I notice is that the angles they've given me don't match up to any of the angle pair names we have, like consecutive interior or alternate exterior. So at first I may not think there's enough information to prove they're parallel. But what I can do is, using vertical angles, I can tell that this angle is 105 degrees and that that angle is 75 degrees, because vertical angles are congruent. And so now, looking at the angle pairs I have, well, those two do have a name. I can call these two angles consecutive interior angles. Now, that's not enough just to prove that the two lines are parallel. I need to show something specific about those two consecutive interior angles, and what I need to prove is that they're supplementary, or I need to test if they're supplementary. So I'm going to add 105 and 75 together and come up with 180 degrees, which checks out, and that does confirm that these two lines are parallel. So to answer their question, is there enough information to prove this? The answer is yeah, there is enough, and my reason is going to be one of those 4 statements, and specifically this time I can say that those lines are parallel because consecutive interior angles are supplementary. On this next diagram, I'm trying to tell whether lines A and B are parallel to each other, and I can see by the transversal I've got alternate exterior angles that are formed, and those 2 tick marks that I just highlighted tell us that those angles are congruent to each other. So the first thing again that I'm noticing is that they are alternate exterior angles. Now that by itself is not enough to prove that the lines are parallel. Alternate exterior angles. But what I need to show about those is that I need to show they're congruent. Because of those tick marks, I do know those alternate exterior angles are congruent. So to answer the question, are the lines parallel? Yes, I can prove they're parallel, and my reason would be because alternate exterior angles are congruent. And next up, this time I can see tick marks that match up to those 2 angles right there, which are corresponding angles, if I remember back to my angle pairs. And the tick marks once again mean that those 2 angles are congruent to each other. So just saying that I have corresponding angles isn't enough to prove the lines are parallel, but because those corresponding angles are congruent, I can say that yeah, those 2 lines would be parallel to each other. A and B would be parallel for the reason that corresponding angles are congruent. And then lastly we have this diagram. Now notice what's given to us. We have alternate interior angles. And again, it's not enough just to note that we have alternate interior angles. I have to prove that those alternate interior angles are congruent. And be careful this time, because what's given to me is that the 2 angles together add up to 180. Which is great, that's awesome that 1 and 2 add up to 180 degrees, but that's not what I need to know. I would need to know specifically something about 1 and 2, and I would need to know that I would need to know that 1 and 2 are congruent to each other. I don't know that. Who cares if they're supplementary? That's not what's important for alternate interior angles. So to answer this question, no, I don't know that these 2 lines would be parallel, and I could say something like alternate interior angles are supposed to be congruent, but they're not. And then lastly, let's go ahead and use our knowledge about alternate interior angles and corresponding angles, all that, to find a value of x that would make these 2 lines parallel to each other. Well, first thing first, figure out what kind of angle pair you're dealing with. So these are the 2 angles that were given to me, and I can recall that those are corresponding angles. And what it means if lines are parallel about corresponding angles is I would need to know that they're congruent to each other. In other words, this angle right here would have to be the same measure as this angle down here. So that will tell me what kind of equation to write. Because I want the 2 angles to be congruent, I'm going to say 3x plus 5 is equal to 65, and then do some algebra to find out my value of x. So I'll subtract 5 from both sides and get 3x equals 60, and then divide by 3. So I come up with an answer of x is 20. Now, a great way to check this would be to go back and plug in that value of x up here. So I've got 3 times 20, which is 60, and 60 plus 5 gets me 65 degrees, which checks out. I do have angles that are congruent now, which would make those lines parallel to each other.